Okay, so I thought we'd talk tonight about worship. And I kind of asked some questions to begin with. What is it? Why do we do it? How much does it matter? And maybe a place to start is in Psalm 29. You can turn there if you like. This Psalm of David, where he begins, ascribe to the Lord, you heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. David begins this psalm by telling the heavenly beings, and who are those? Well, angels, I suppose, or whatever other heavenly beings there might be. These people who are these beings who are, they're not us, right? They're
Can everyone hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
You're back now.
Back.
Okay, sorry. We're just going to push through. So all these heavenly beings are told to worship God, worship him. And the way the poetry works, worship is ascribing the Lord the glory due his name. It's worshiping the God in the splendor of holiness. So maybe a good way to begin in talking about worship is that worship is ascribing glory to God. And I don't know if that helps. How would you define worship?
Presenting your bodies a living sacrifice.
Okay, Romans 12, we're going to get there. Absolutely. Presenting your body as a living sacrifice. So what else? How else would you describe worship? What would you say about worship?
Well, God sure likes our worship.
God likes our worship. Okay.
Something that we could do for him.
So when we worship, what do we do?
I was thinking about, to answer your first question about worship, is I think it can be done collectively and it can be done individually.
Okay.
And loudly, verbally, and silently. So
Okay.
it's something that we can share with one another. That I know I loved it, the singing, and I love that we're all together, and that helps me worship. And then there's times I like the solitude of my prayer and my thoughts and letting the scriptures talk to me if I'm attentive enough. But anyway, all of that, that's worship. That's honoring God and saying that there's something greater and just praise and deserves honor, and kind of lifting God up that way.
Okay, praise, lifting God up. I think you're absolutely right. I think that
I think we've lost Patrick, but Colette, I agree with you. I was also going to say for me, I think a little bit differently about what I would call corporate worship versus individual worship or what have you. You know, there's so many different versions of what worship is.
Yeah. So it's different versions of worship. Yeah. And I think, that it takes different forms. It can be collective. It can be individual, as Colette said. It can be, it can take these various forms, but yeah.
Yeah, those are ways we express it, but I guess what it fundamentally is an acknowledgement of the order of the universe.
Okay.
We really see that in Paul's letters, with the worshipful sections sort of start with descriptions of who God is and who we are, and how those things are related.
Okay,
That includes what God has done for us, what we should feel in terms of obligation to Him as a result of that. A proclamation of that is what worship is.
okay.
And we use preaching and singing and prayer just to express that.
Okay, so Matt's talking about how worship is sort of acknowledging the order of the universe. God is above, and in various ways, we acknowledge that, and we recognize that, and we talk about that, and we describe that, and we give God the glory He is due through that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something that's sort of slippery to define sometimes, but I think we're hitting on some things that are pretty important.
We've been talking about it in a Bible sense, but the word is not just used in a Bible sense. In England, you can refer to certain people as your worship. In the Book of Common Prayer, the marriage ceremony was, with this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship. So it's any situation in which you acknowledge the needs or demands of somebody else as controlling you, or something that you're going to honor. Which, by the way, I got to admit here, as Patrick will know, the English word is not necessarily a really good equivalent of the Greek and Hebrew word, but nonetheless, I mean, it's used to package a lot of the same ideas. And anyway.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's interesting. We do understand it from that sense, right? That somebody else is in charge, in control. We are bowing ourselves to someone else for various reasons, whether, in the old marriage ceremony, with my body I thee worship, it's a decision, right? A choice to submit to someone, and they do the same. In a ceremonial kind of situation, then obviously there's a status that you don't have, and so that's why you bow and you submit. But I think what Matt says about acknowledging the way the universe is ordered is pretty interesting, and I think pretty helpful, and also goes to why do we do it? Dan said God likes our worship, and I think He does. But
Scripture indicates.
yeah, but does He need our worship?
No.
Does God change? I remember seeing this movie one time, and it was set in the Roman Empire, and I don't know, some Roman general was conquering a barbarian tribe, and the battle was pretty much over, and the leader of the barbarian tribe came to him and bowed down before him and said, let us live so our gods will have someone to worship. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting way of talking about, let us live so our gods will have someone to worship. Well, that's not our God, right? He doesn't need our worship in that sense. But it is necessary for us to be able to acknowledge His glory, acknowledge that He is above us, acknowledge that we aren't Him, right? I mean, that's one of the chief things for worship to me, is that it reminds me that I'm not God. He is, and I'm not, right? So I think that sort of touches on why we do it, and how, what it is, and what it looks like. What are some of the ways that you've found that makes worship, if not easy, at least makes you more likely to worship or more able to worship? What are some of the things that help you in being able to worship?
I said it earlier. I think songs really help me to get in, and I play music all the time, all kinds of Christian and non-Christian music that helps me reflect on God and who he is. And I think about his attributes. And I love when we do it as a congregation. That's one of the ways that helps me to kind of, especially if I'm running late on Sunday and I sit down and the song's already going, I go, okay, whew. It helps me get to where I want to be as far as setting my mind to think about God and people and needs, that kind of thing. But I think this really helps me. Our music really helps.
Yeah.
It's one of the things.
I agree. Singing to me, and one of the reasons that I love corporate worship, corporate singing is to sort of look around and you can see people, and just so you know, I sort of, glance around during because I like seeing people singing. I like seeing the expressions on their faces or how they're, what they look like as they're singing. I find that helpful to me, to be encouraged by other people around me worshiping, and it helps me to center on that and to focus on that. Good songs. I mean, and there are songs that I think are more worshipful than others, and I respond better to. But yeah, I think that's right. I think singing, and I think God's people through the centuries have found singing music to be an indispensable part of worship. It's something that we can't do without.
I want to hog up the time, but years ago, a friend of mine, she's from South Africa, and she was in my backyard and she was dancing and moving and, like she was skipping, and I didn't know what she was doing. And then when she came inside and I said, Portia, what were you, she says, I just danced to the Lord. I sing songs and dance to the Lord. And I thought, I got to try that. And so, but it's different ways people do it that you learn from that inspire me. And, I don't know. Just thought that was a memory just popped in my head.
That's neat. Yeah, that's neat to be able to sort of, get a peek at that and see, somebody who's literally dancing like no one's watching, right?
I'm in on their private time.
Yeah, but that's kind of neat to get that glimpse and to see that. Yeah.
Ironically, I was just talking to Patrick about a song that had been edited to drop a verse about dancing to Jesus. Because that might be, but actually, we talk about singing, and certainly I like talking about singing, but many people would say any kind of art form can sometimes bring people closer to God. Some people really find, visual art like painting or something can connect to them. For some, it's reading, and it's a book that has tells a certain story or something that leads them to become closer to God. And I think that's often what artists are striving towards. They talk about being inspired, right? It may be a reaching out kind of thing.
I'm reminded, as you're saying that, I'm a Springsteen fan, as you all know, and there's a line in an interview. He did an interview about 20 years ago, and he was talking about how he wrote his songs. And as the quote was, the verses are the blues, the chorus is the gospel. And I really like that. That really sort of struck me. And I kind of get that. And I think what you're saying, you're talking about art. And I think people do, even maybe artists who don't really acknowledge God themselves, know that there's something in us that wants to worship, that wants to acknowledge something bigger than us and wants to sort of set that order. And so oftentimes you do find worshipful stuff in art. You're absolutely right.
And then to just flip it around, some people, instead of reaching to external stimuli, they want to turn inward or focus on solitude and the like. And somehow that allows them to draw. And all of this is a lot of which is going to saying that, well, and maybe you were trying to get this, Patrick, but some types of worship are going to appeal more to certain people than others. It's not a one size fits all kind of thing. Some people really just don't care much for the singing. They're there for the sermon. That's a very small group, Patrick. But you know, but you see what I'm saying. It's not uncommon for people to have different parts of the worship service, or focus more on certain types of worship, which is not to say they shouldn't do others, but certain things are going to just resonate more with them where they are at a time than certain other things are.
You mentioned solitude. I'm thinking of the times where Jesus went away, by himself, and sometimes right in the middle of a busy day, he just stepped away and went to pray. Prayer obviously is a huge part of worship, I think, and those things are sort of intertwined. And we can pray together, but we can pray individually. And Jesus spent that time in solitude as well. I think sometimes even. Okay, sorry. Everybody good? Okay, so
You can also try to move to one of those seats.
Okay, so good. A couple of things that struck me that I wanted to sort of talk about too. Deuteronomy 13. I don't know if anybody read Deuteronomy 13, but Deuteronomy 13 is this sort of I don't know what you'd even call it, but it's God says through Moses, if a prophet says we should let's follow other gods you have not known, and let us worship them, then you shouldn't listen to them, and you in fact should put them to death. If your own close family member says, let's go worship other gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, don't yield, show them no mercy, put them to death. If in a town you hear about this mass worshiping, following of other gods, again, gods you have not known, put to the sword all who live in that town. I mean, it's this kind of awful chapter about how serious it is. All right, back again. Sorry.
I think one of the reasons that is taken so seriously is that pretty much every other form of worship is a manipulative tool
Okay.
that we use. The worship of God is unique because we're not doing it for that reason.
Okay.
Pagan worship is all about appeasement of the gods to try to elicit a response or favor or something. And that's often the goal of cults, like they're describing in the chapter. Groups springing up, they're trying to manipulate their followers into doing something for their own designs.
Right.
Manipulation of people is frowned upon in scripture in other contexts as well.
Yeah, we're not right. Worship of God isn't to control others, and that's something that comes up unfortunately sometimes, but is used that way, but it's not supposed to be. And the whole idea in that chapter about gods you haven't known. Israel knew God, right? God had revealed himself to Israel for generations. So Israel had no excuse, no reason to worship other gods. They knew this God who had made this covenant with them. And so it's a rejection of him to seek other gods. The idea that God is jealous comes up 18 times. I counted today, 18 times in the Old Testament. God is said to be jealous.
Are you back? Hi, can anybody hear us?
Okay.
You're back.
You're asking about God being.
God being jealous. How does that sit with you? God being jealous.
The classic definition of that always is that you don't want someone else to have something that you view as yours.
Right.
And everything belongs to God. He knows it, and he resents us giving ourselves to other beings or whatever, or acting like somebody else is deserving of the worship that he's deserving.
Yeah.
We can't fault him for that because that's the way things are. He owns everything.
The interesting thing to me, the thing that always sort of struck a strange chord with me is, those other gods don't exist. Why is God jealous? But I think you're hitting on something maybe, that it's not that God is jealous of other gods, it's that God is jealous for his people, right? God's jealous for us. God wants that relationship with us, that exclusivity, that undivided covenant loyalty, and resents it when we share that with other objects of worship, I guess is a way to put it, because we don't worship other gods, right? So I think that this idea that worship is acknowledging God's glory, acknowledging the way that the universe is, and that God is greater, and we're his creation, we're his people, is essential to worship, is central to why we do it, and what it entails and what it involves. And in that sense, I think a lot of things can be worship, right? A lot of things can be avenues of worship. We can worship and would it help if I just if I just ignored, if I just deleted, if I just took the laptop off, and is the laptop working?
Laptop's perfectly fine.
So if I just face the laptop,
Whatever you want to do.
Yeah, maybe it's the things.
you know what? I'm going to do that. I'm going to bail out here and just face the laptop, see if that helps. What's that now?
Oh, you need to be closer, right? Because I think that that's the only audio source since the laptop mic.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
What if I sit right here so everybody else can still be seen?
Perfect.
That's the best
Can everybody hear
I can do
okay?
right now.
Can.
I'm having trouble now seeing everybody else because my glass is a bit of the.
I'll keep track.
Okay, so let's just try it this way. Maybe the problem was the laptop. Or the iPad. So
That's a good point, though. So many of the things we brought up for stimulating worship involve sort of divorcing ourselves from everyday life. But making everyday life a part of that has its place too.
I think so. I mean, I do think there's still time to, to maybe to step aside, to take time by yourself, take time away from everyday life, so to speak. But I do think so. I was sort of thinking about Mark 7. You can turn to Mark 7 if you want to. Somebody read, if you would, Mark 7, 5-8. And I think this will maybe sort of address what you're talking about. Somebody want to read Mark 7, 5-8 for us?
I'll read it. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live accordingly to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with unclean hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about the hypocrites, as it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men.'"
So they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They're hypocrites, he says. Now, it dawned on me at some point, that's a strange way to describe them, because they're not, at least in the way I usually think of a hypocrite. To me, a hypocrite is somebody who says, you shouldn't steal, but then they're stealing, right? The Pharisees aren't hypocrites in that way, because they are washing their hands the way they want Jesus and his disciples to wash their hands. He doesn't call them hypocrites because they're wanting Jesus to do something that they don't do. They do it, right? So how are they hypocrites? In what way are they hypocrites?
I think they're hypocrites in exactly the way you said, except it's not about washing hands. It's about living out God's decrees and living out a life marked by God's influence. They're insisting that Jesus and the apostles follow this rule, but their worship is in vain because they have no personal connection with God. It's all about the tradition. So I mean, it's not about the exact act. It's about how their hearts, what occupies their hearts.
And verse 8, you have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human tradition. You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. And then there's the example. God says, honor your father and mother. Well, you find in your religious ceremonies a way to get around that, right? by this religious act of making your money korban devoted to God, and then you keep it and you don't do anything for your parents. And he goes on to talk about how nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. So the Pharisees are about the rules of hand washing and what you can eat. And Jesus says they're not worshiping God. They're trying to keep these traditions. They're hypocrites. They're play actors in the sense that they're sort of living out this script that makes them look righteous without really, as you put it, Josh, without having a life that's connected to God and to pleasing him and to serving him, that kind of worship that we've been sort of talking about, that goes far beyond what you do when you're sitting in church on Sunday.
It's the role of ritual.
Okay.
Being discussed.
Yeah.
The ritual itself has power, and all you need to do is go through the ritual.
Right.
But God seems to say, if there is ritual that I ask you to perform, because it's supposed to be an expression of the heart.
Yeah,
And if it's not,
yeah.
it's useless. It's basically saying ritual by itself has no power at all.
Yeah.
That would go for some of the rituals we have now as New Testament Christians, like baptism.
Yeah.
It means nothing if it's not an expression of the heart.
Or singing, or listening to a sermon, or preaching a sermon, or right, there's and sometimes I think we think heart means you gotta feel it, and I think it has more to do with authenticity, genuineness, and sometimes that involves feeling, but for the Pharisees, the problem seems to be that their authenticity was directed at their traditions, at keeping their traditions. That's what they were concerned about. That's what they were interested in. And it had become for them all of worship. To the extent that then they could, some of them at least, there's actually some interesting books being written recently about the Pharisees, and we paint with a broad brush and we say the Pharisees this, but some of them, certainly some of the ones Jesus came in contact with, worship had become about these particular acts of ritual law, and not about an authentic life given to God.
It's like you're checking off items on a list,
Yeah,
but you're forgetting why you're doing it.
yeah,
What's the purpose behind what I'm doing? Like you take communion and let's chew a little piece of cracker and drink a little water, but you're not thinking about why you're doing it. What is the solemn reason behind it, and what is it that you're supposed to be remembering when you do it?
right.
On the other hand.
Yeah.
There's a role that ritual can have in reorienting the mind.
Absolutely.
Or as a tool, so that makes it a difficult discussion sometimes.
Well, and one of the things to remember is that, where did all these rules come from? Well, they came from God, they came, you weren't supposed to eat certain things. That came from God. That was not something the Pharisees made up. Now they developed a whole system around that, but the ritual itself mattered, apparently. But as the prophets often said, it doesn't matter if it's divorced from a life of worship. Somebody else was going to say something.
I was just going to add that I think you've got two conundrums, actually three there about worship, which is there surely are different levels of worship, right? I mean, we've got Brother Lawrence, who was, as he's cleaning the dishes, was practicing the presence of God. We'd all like to get to that point, but even if we accept what Brother Lawrence was doing, it was not concentrated worship, right? It was sort of a lower level of worship mixed in with his day-to-day activities. And so he was sort of sanctifying them, but it wasn't quite the same as when he was in chapel.
Yeah.
Right. There are times then we turn to more concentrated worship, and we use tools to do that, to praise, and that's more heightened worship. But another thing you mentioned was the issue of feeling. And that's really a difficult issue, because remember when we talked about what worship was, there wasn't anything about what I get out of it, right? That wasn't part of it. And yet, a lot of people today, when they go to a worship service, they walk away saying, oh, well, the song service was just lousy. I just hated those songs, or the sermon wasn't very good, or the prayer was boring. I just didn't get anything out of it. And I get that.
I do.
On the other hand, maybe you just didn't put a lot into it. I mean, the whole idea of worship seems to be pretty much directed towards God. And the idea, and so I am a little skeptical of going to worship that I'm going to get swept away by the rock band and loud music and flaring lights and everything. Well, the people in Nuremberg were swept away also, by the crowd mentality and the like. That's not really what I would hope that it's like a backwash of what we send to God. We get a backwash that makes us feel good and the like. But I think we have to ask ourselves, if we didn't get a lot out of it, what did we put in, and what's the chicken before the egg kind of thing here? If you're not putting much in, are you really expecting to get anything really edifying back out? Same thing with the ritual, right? How much are you going to invest in it?
Right.
And maybe it's best to do it because maybe you'll get something or be motivated to put something into it. But if it's just empty, I'm not surprised if you don't walk away feeling enriched. But this is a push-pull kind of thing.
I think one of the interesting things to me, I mean, what we've been talking about, if we're right in our theory that worship is kind of about the order of the universe, right, and acknowledging that God is bigger than us, I'm not sure that what we get out of it necessarily is going to be every time a good feeling. I think sometimes it will be. I think sometimes it won't be. And maybe we just kind of need to get past that idea that it was a bad worship service if I didn't come away feeling a particular way. I don't want to discount feelings because we are emotional creatures, right? We have emotions and God made us that way. But I'm not sure that's the goal, is to capture some kind of feeling. I think the goal is kind of what we're talking about, right? To acknowledge that God is bigger than us, that God is greater than us, and sing about his glory and tell, one of the things that I find interesting in the Psalms is how often they consist of somebody telling the story of how God did this, how God intervened, how God stepped in. Well, we got a story to tell, right? So worship for us can sometimes just be telling that story. And that may make us feel good. It may make us not feel good at a particular time. But I think something's still accomplished, even if we don't come out of it feeling how we want to. And I think ritual and tradition and even habit can factor into that. It can help us do that. But I think you're right, Ron. I think to overplay the idea of feeling is. I was thinking of John chapter 4. Verse 20, where Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, right? And the Samaritan woman. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, she means Mount Gerizim. But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. So she's asking this question, where is it appropriate to worship? Where should we be worshiping? And Jesus says, believe me, a time is coming when you'll worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Now, that was a shocking statement in Jesus' day, right? The time's coming when neither are going to be particularly helpful. You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kinds of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. She says, where should we worship? Jesus comes back with, how should we worship? And in spirit and in truth is the response. And true worshipers is the emphasis. We sometimes get sort of hung up on that phrase in spirit and in truth, but don't forget Jesus says true worshipers worship this way. People who worship in truth. The closest parallel is probably 1 John 3, where John says, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. So I think Jesus is talking about that authenticity, right? That life of authenticity in which your worship is just an expression of the truth that you understand about yourself and about God and about all of that. And your worship just comes out.
That's kind of the same definition, right?
Yeah.
We've been using, it's the way things are.
Way things are, yeah.
Whether we want to acknowledge them or not.
Yeah.
Hey,
Worship
Patrick, I was
Yeah.
thinking about what Ron said in terms of the feelings or how you feel on that. And then I was thinking about what Matt said when he was saying, kind of the difference between pagan worship and our worship is pagans are doing it for a particular outcome that's there versus worshiping the being that should be worshiped. And with it being VBS time, I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they said, but even if he doesn't,
Yep.
right? So that was an act of worship to him, a public act of worship to him that says, that's who we're going to rely on. He can save us. But regardless of outcome, I'm not worshiping him because he is going to save us. He can or he can't, but I'm going to worship him anyway. It just kind of struck that chord with me as they were talking about that.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah,
Colette.
that just made me think too, when we were talking about the heart and now in John, is that it's my responsibility to be intentional about where my heart is at.
Yeah.
And I think we want kind of the external thing, the music, to get me there. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But it's worshiping in vain if I don't pause and make sure I'm paying attention, making sure I'm honoring the God of the universe, the God that keeps everything in order. That I think intentionality is what's needed. It's a responsibility of the worshiper to make sure the heart is where it should be. And sometimes we don't know that, but it's a work, it's a growth. And I guess that's why we start out in Sunday school in different ways and reading scripture. But if I just let church happen to me or the songs happen to me, my heart is not always in it. Go ahead, Ron.
No, yeah, I just think this is a really important truth. And, I first sort of discovered it in looking into prayer. Not surprisingly, the same principle applies to worship. Some people, when they pray, they feel God's presence and they get, you hear about them and all this type of stuff. And they're the people who talk the most. But there are a lot of people who never get that feeling, or only rarely get that feeling. And you can't dictate that when you're going to pray or how you're going to pray by your feelings, right? It has value to God, maybe even more value to God, when you're doing it and knowing that I'm probably not going to get anything back from this. Now, this is not an excuse for boring worship services, but still, right, the point is, you shouldn't get discouraged if you're giving what you can give and honoring God. That has value. You should feel good. You should feel, there we go. You should feel good about that. I mean, you should value that, even if you didn't get a warm fuzzy, or you weren't on cloud 9 or transported to the third heaven, during When Peace Like a River. Now, mind you, I think you should have been, because that's just a great song. But, that's important to know. It wasn't wasted. To do it.
But Ron, you're making a great point, because it's how we individually react to everything. Some people, in excitement, they see you and they scream. Other people go, hey, but that doesn't mean they're not excited to see you. It's just a different way in which they express it. And that's why I go back to what I was saying earlier. That's why I think it's the responsibility of me to get my heart in it, however that looks, be it screaming, be it clapping, be it a cymbal, that I'm playing the cymbals at, whatever it is, it's, and I think this is another thought I'm having. I think it's really important collectively when we worship that we understand that people are going to worship differently in our setting. Some people rock, some people barely move their lips, but that doesn't mean that the intent of their heart, that they're there serving God, is not taking place. And so we have to be, and I say this from a personal experience. I think I shared it with the ladies once. I was dating this young man and he wanted to pray over the phone. And so he began to pray. And so he was going, he said, Lord God, before every part of his prayer. And I was like, and then I was convicted. And I said, you know what, God, he wasn't praying for me. Why do I care? Why am I being so critical? And that's a market, this is years ago, that's a market thing in me, to remember that everybody worships differently and how they pray is different, how they sing, what it means to them. And that I need to back up and not be critical if they're not doing it like me. And I know that's not a part of the lesson, but tonight, but that, I think that changed me in being more inclusive of different ways of worshiping, and not.
It absolutely is part of this, because the authenticity, right? That's what we're talking about, authentic worship. And if people are worshiping authentically, then we do want to sort of police people's style, right? Or because often the whole discussions of worship in the church just come down to what kind of songs we're going to sing. What's the cutoff date for writing of songs, that we're gonna use, either forwards or backwards, where are we gonna, and what's the style that we're gonna use? I know of a church in the area, I won't say which one, but I know of a church in the area that at least at one point was giving song leaders a list of about 80 songs, and you can choose from these. And that was it. that was all you could choose from. That was all we're gonna sing. That was all we're gonna use. There's a sense sometimes of wanting to police, wanting to sort of everybody do it the way we do it, because that must be right. But
just one thing quick to Colette's point too, though. We were talking about truth and authenticity. Sometimes, right, I show up in worship and I am incredibly worried about this, or I'm incredibly distracted about what's going on at work, or, the world events have got me all upset and these things are pressing on my mind. And then we say, I can't worship. No, you can. But what you just do is you acknowledge to God, I'm coming before you, God, and I'm just really distracted by all of these things. And so this is what I can do right now. And I think God values that as well, right? That in the midst of the distraction, you are taking time to try to focus on him. And he's going to understand that that's hard. And this may not be the deepest dive you've ever done into worship because of those things. But it's what Colette said, it's going to be authentic. It's going to be true, right? Because you're not pretending to be in a situation where you're not.
Right.
And that's fine. That's fine. It doesn't have to be that deep dive where I walk away feeling like I'm glowing all the time.
I would argue when you're struggling, when you're coming in, beaten down and hurting, that's when you do need to worship, right? That's when look at the songs. How many of the songs start with, I'm in a hole, pull me out, right? How many of the songs start with that? I think that's something we need to acknowledge sometimes when we come to worship. I'm in a hole, help. I need salvation. I need you to and in worship we are reminding ourselves, and we're testifying to everyone else that even when I'm in a hole, I know who's God, and I know who's in charge, and I know who's all powerful, and I'm placing myself in his hands. That authenticity then is what leads us to what Alan talked about earlier on, living sacrifices, right? Giving your body as a living sacrifice. We don't worship with dead sacrifices as believers in Jesus. We worship the way Jesus worshiped, by giving ourselves as living sacrifices to God, so that we can be holy and blameless, and that's all the time, right? That's the way. That's our reasonable act of worship, Paul says in Romans 12, and that's leads to this authentic life where we live lives in which we are worshiping, we are serving, we are his people, always.
And if we don't worship when things are hard, we're never going to build the habits of worshiping when things are hard. It's like exercising, right? It's when I'm feeling great and like I could run a mile and conquer the world, it's no problem to exercise for an hour or so. That's the easiest thing ever. But if I'm feeling bad, if I've had a long day, if I'm a little sore, a little sick, it's that's when your commitment is really tested.
Right.
And I think we sort of see worship sometimes as this thing that just happens to us, but I think it's a skill that we build and we develop, throughout our lives and all.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Patrick, I just wanted to say that there's been several times at worship service, and sitting there listening to the sermon, it's like it's directed to me. It makes me feel as though I'm involved in what you're preaching, and it just makes me feel like, wow, it's like that the sermon is directed to me.
And see, I think I would say, Linda, that that's because you're listening with a heart attuned to worship. You want to honor God. You want to give yourself to Him, and so I think that's why that happens sometimes. I've been in those situations too. And I think that's why that happens sometimes, because you're in a position where you're wanting to worship, and you're wanting to serve God, and you're wanting to be in that proper relationship with Him. So yeah, I think that's something we cultivate, we develop, and worship.
I also think that's the Spirit working within us, Patrick. I mean, I've
Sure.
often thought that, because you may preach a sermon and 5 different people in the audience hear that and apply it in a different way that applies directly to them. And I've always felt like, when I'm getting convicted by something that you're saying or pricked in the heart, I think that's one of the ways that the Spirit works within us to prick our conscience and to hear that.
That's
Absolutely.
exactly, you explained it so well, Steve.
Absolutely right. Absolutely
Thanks.
right. Matt, what are you gonna say?
If worship is about acknowledging the structure of the universe, then the core function of it has to be sort of acknowledging our place in it.
Mhm.
In a sense, embracing whatever our reality is, whether it's good or bad. Yep, the sounds are full of that. This is terrible. I don't understand it, but I know this is who you are, and
Yeah, well, I
I'm going
worship.
to find a way to deal with it. Yeah. The creation of a certain construct, like we were talking about, based on feelings, is the opposite of that.
I was thinking of Job. His wife says, "Curse God and die." And he says, "Don't be foolish. Don't be ridiculous." And he is going to honor God, even if it kills him. Right? He's going to worship God. Well, thank you very much. We got to go. I kept you late. I'm sorry about that. It was my fault. We were having a problem, but. Anyway, thank you for your thoughts and I always enjoy your comments. And I knew I'd get a lot out of hearing you tonight, so I appreciate that very much. Hope you guys have a great week.